Hi, welcome everybody. We are getting settled. We're going to let people trickle in, get settled down, and then we will get started in just a minute. But thank you all for coming out and getting excited about learning about the new electrical code changes that are going to get taken into consideration and get started in September. So while we're waiting, I'll just let everybody know this is the second of six classes that we're doing, I think, six or seven. And we had one on Monday. If you did not get to see that, or if you'd like to review that, we have it on our website. I will put that information where that lives in the chat in a minute. But it lives there. You can share that. We have today's class, and then we have a few more that you're welcome to register for. We also have a couple of other series that we have available. One is the DSD Info series, and that goes over this month. We're going to talk about why code is important. We cover all sorts of things. In June, we're going to cover about hoarding. So all sorts of things are covered there. And then we also have the Land Development Academy, which is more geared towards, I would say, like the professional development community. Kind of gets more into the nitty-gritty details about some of the more complex topics, zoning and code, and but all of those are available. You are welcome to register for that. I will have all that information later. But everybody's getting logged in. So again, my name is Leah Adrian. I work in development services in the stakeholder and community engagement group. I will be helping Marty today. Martin Stewart's going to be giving our president. Starrett is going to be giving our presentation today about Chapter 2 of the 2026 National Electrical Code changes. Again, with that, I will go over to today's format. So we are going to have Martin's going to give a presentation, and then afterwards we'll have a Q&A session depending on time. While we are going through the presentation, if you do have a question and you just want to get it out there so you don't forget about it, there's a Q&A box. You should see a little question mark at the bottom of your screen. You're welcome to type that in as we're going along. And then if at the end of the presentation, we will also be able to raise your hand and you can ask your question there. We do ask that you don't use the chat function unless you have technical problems or something like that, just because we want to capture any questions you may have. So please use that Q&A box. Yeah, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to Martin. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself and we can get going.
Yes, thank you, Leah. I'm Marty Starrett, Division Manager, Commercial Building Inspections with Austin Development Services, and I'll be presenting today the changes from Chapter 2. Next slide. So a few things, if you weren't here from the one on Monday, I will try to capture as many changes as I can, but I may miss a few. I will not be covering any medium voltage articles or some of the subtle changes. I will look at a few here or there. You will not receive any continuing education credits. This presentation is only informational. And like Leah said, we might hopefully at the end, if there's time, we'll open it up for questions or comments. All right, with that, we'll get started. We're looking at Chapter 2, that's wiring and protection. Next slide. So Article 200, the use and identification of grounded conductors. A lot of people might be a neutral. Next slide. So 200.7 means of identifying grounded conductors. We've got a revision that was added to allow for a single stripe other than green for the identification of the grounded conductor. So you would have white with you could have white with any color other than green. Next slide. Article 206, non-power limited remote control and signaling circuits, is a new article. It outlines the general requirements for non-power limited remote control and signaling circuits that was previously found in Article 300.26. In that previous article, it referenced installation requirements in accordance with Articles 300.2 through 300.25. So now all those requirements are found in this new article. Next slide. All right, we'll get into the branch circuits, Article 210. So, as I said last session on Monday, that dot three is where you'll find your reconditioned equipment requirements. And we have that in Article 210. It tells you that reconditioned GFCI protection of personnel and AFCI protection are not allowed. So you will not be able to use any refurbished equipment for those items. Next slide. All right, Article 210.8, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel. As I don't know if you've heard or not, but May is National Electrical Safety Month. And one of the safety items we have in the electrical industry is the ground fault circuit interrupter. So it's kind of good that we're in our chapter 2 today for that reason. So one of the things in the parent uh, text is the previous exception for rooftop receptacles was moved from 210.8b to the parent text. That was originally over the other dwellings, so now it'll apply for dwellings as well. If you remember what that, or if you don't know what that says, that is that ground fault circuit interrupter protection has to be readily accessible, but that exception for rooftop receptacles says it only has to be accessible from the roof. Next slide, please. Article 210.8 also includes a new informational note that was added to recognize Class A GFCIs marked HF. The informational note also says HF plus. I don't believe these have even been manufactured or they've got these yet. HFs are just now barely starting to come on the market. These will address those high frequency ground faults. Next slide. Okay, 210.8A, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel dwelling units. So, one thing about 2026, there's no new GFCI requirements for dwelling units. That hasn't happened probably since when ground faults were first put in the code. Usually every code cycle they add something new, but this time they didn't. But the revision that we do have includes modification of GFCI protection of garages, accessory buildings, and indoor and damp and wet locations. But basically, those were just kind of a format. There was no additional language added. It was just kind of, they're more in a list view now. But they did add an exception that was added for bathroom exhaust fans. So if you have, as you know, there's a factory receptacle installed in most bathroom exhaust fans, and the exception says that if that is factory installed, that it you don't have to have GFCI protection for that receptacle unless the manufacturer tells you. FYI, some manufacturers, if you install these exhaust fans over a tub or a shower, they tell you that it has to be connected to GFCI protected branch circuit installed in the ceiling. But if it's not in those areas and the manufacturer doesn't say it, it does not have to be GFCI protected. Next slide. Article 210.8b, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel other than dwelling units. Similar to the dwelling units, there were some modifications of the GFCI protection in indoor damp, wet locations, open aquatic vessels, and the reorganization of the exceptions. There was nothing added. It was just kind of formatted different now, more clear. Exception 2 was also revised, providing specific conditions for the use of an assured equipment grounding program in industrial establishments. Next slide. Uh, Article 210.8F, ground fault circuit interrupter protection for personnel outdoor outlets. They did increase the amperage threshold from 50 amps to 60 amps for single phase branch circuit rated 150 volts or less to ground. So if you have a an outdoor outlet and it's 60 amps single phase 150 volts or less to ground, you will now have to provide ground fault circuit interrupter protection. Next slide. Okay. Also, as a lot of you know, we've had this whole HVAC GFCI protection issue. It's going on since the 2020 code. In this particular article, they did add a new exception, number 3, that permits a listed Class C special GFCI protection for listed HVAC equipment, along with Class A. But if you happen to use one of these Class C special GFCIs, you have to label the disconnect with a warning Class C special GFCI protection provided for HVAC unit. Also in that article, in the 2023, we had an exception number 2 that GFCI protection not required for listed HVAC equipment will expire September 1st of 2026. So going by if you look at the 2026 code, the GFCI protection for HVAC equipment would be required after September 1st of 2026. I will say that the state of Texas currently, when they are working on a rule, first of all, to adopt the 2026 National Electric Code September 1st, but they're also adding something to a Part B pertaining to this section. The department adopts exception number 2 relating to the exemption of listed heat and ventilation and air conditioning equipment without expiration. So what that means is their the state of Texas will continue uh, the exception for no GFCI protection for listed HVAC equipment, and because it'll be a statewide uh, rule, the city of Austin will also follow the same enforcement plan. So as it stands, come September 1st, in the state of Texas, if this rule goes through, which I'm sure it will, there you will not have to GFCI protect the HVAC equipment until that rule gets changed. Next slide. Article 210.12B, arc fault circuit interrupter protection dwelling units. Again, there was no new arc fault circuit interrupter requirements added. What we've had in the 2023 will currently stand. But in B, they did add an exception for the relief of AFCI protection for arc welding equipment was expanded to include garages and accessory buildings. So there was no new requirements added to dwelling units than what we already have. FYI, National Electrical Safety Month, arc fault circuit interrupters is another electrical safety device that helps the home, protects against electrical fires. Next slide. Also in Article 210.12E, uh, where you have branch circuit wiring extensions, modifications, or replacement, they added the words or switch. This provides another option when you're doing extensions or modifications. They make a arc fault type switch now, so you'll be able to where we've had to use devices or receptacles before. Now in 2026, you could actually use one of these switches. Next slide. I'm going to kind of look at four things at once here for ground fault protection of equipment, GFPE, not only in the branch circuit, the feeder article, the service article, and the overcurrent protection article. They've, with the anticipated increase in DC applications, the ground fault protection equipment for solidly grounded wide DC systems was expanded. So they've in each one of these articles, they've added the DC to those because a lot more of that's being used now. Next slide. Article 210.17, guest rooms and guest suites. The revision added dormitories with permanent means of cooking to follow dwelling branch circuit requirements. So if you have a dormitory that has permanent means of cooking, you're going to have to follow those dwelling unit requirements, which include, you have your outlets placed and required branch circuits and that kind of thing. Similar to what we do right now in hotels and motels. Next slide. Article 210.22, permissible loads, individual branch circuits. In 2020, they started adding this 10 amp branch circuit. In this particular article here, they did add a new exception that clarifies the prohibited use of a 10 amp circuit to supply receptacle outlets. In 2023, they had it, but now in 2026, they've removed it. Next slide. And part of this whole 10 amp conversation in 210.23A, permissible loads, multiple outlet branch circuits, the revised article allows 10 amp branch circuits to serve lighting outlets and dwelling unit exhaust fans on bathroom and laundry lighting circuits. So pretty much that 10 amp branch circuit will only be able to be used for these items, no receptacle outlets. So you'll be able to use it for lights and exhaust fans that are on lighting circuits. Next slide. Article 210.24, branch circuit requirements summary tables. The revision to tables 210.24.1 and 2 will now allow a 16 gauge copper or 14 gauge copper clad aluminum conductors for 10 amp branch circuits. So this is the introduction of the 16 gauge wire copper will be able to be used for a 10 amp circuit. And as we go on with this series, we'll notice this change in Article 310 and a lot of the cable articles. So now the minimum size will be 16 gauge copper. Next slide. Article 210.52, dwelling unit receptacle outlets. A revision to item 2 added the words wall switch. allowing for either a wall switch or approved wall mounted control device in accordance with 21070A1, exception 1. Previous 2023, it only had approved wall mounted control devices. So basically, they added the word wall switch to line up with 21070A1, exception 1. You'll find a lot of changes in the 2026 are just little things that uh, make sense, or if one article says it, then this other article should say it as well. So that's what they did here with add the word wall switch. Next slide. 21052A2, dwelling unit receptacle outlets, general provisions, wall space, a revision to exclude any fixed cabinet from wall space measurements. So you would treat a fixed cabinet pretty much like you would do a door. It will not be included in your wall space measurement. It was previously, but now it's being excluded. Next slide. Couple of articles, similar content. Article 21052A5 and 21052C4. Basically, what this says on these is receptacle outlets are prohibited within 24 inches of countertops at islands, peninsulas, and other work surface. This includes any adjacent wall space. There is an exception for receptacle outlets installed in drawers. So basically, what those two articles are saying is in that 24-inch space below the countertop or work surface, you will not be able to have a receptacle in those areas. They'll be prohibited. And there was no change in the peninsular or island requirements. And you still can't you won't be able to put them on the side because of these two articles here. It'll either have to be, installed in the countertop or in a backsplash above the countertop, or you can install for future uh, installations. Next slide. So this has kind of been an issue because laundry areas are required a lighting outlet by our current code, and I believe 2020 as well. So whenever you look at this is a laundry area, but the problem was that if I put a light in that area, uh, it's kind of covered up in the closet or it's no space. So now we've got an actual code that says, or an exception to a code that says, hey, you could bring that light outside of that area if it's a closet. So it was added to allow a lighting outlet and its control switch to be installed outside the laundry area if a closet houses laundry equipment. That's makes sense because you wouldn't have been able to put it up in there anyway. But this is kind of like, I'm sure there was probably some discussions between installers and inspectors like, well, it says the laundry area, you got to put it in there. And well, I can't. Can I put it here? Well, no, it says you got to go in there. Kind of clears up a lot of that enforcement issue. We'll see a lot of that in the 2026 as well. Next slide. 21070C, all occupancies, lighting revision was added to prohibit exclusive automatic control of lighting in these areas because it could leave an occupant stranded in the dark. You could still have them, but they're going to have a manual override. Next slide, please. Article 215, feeders. Next slide. Okay, so a couple of articles, similar language. Article 215.18A and Article 230.67A, which is found in the service article. Surge protection devices. So a new list item 5 was added to include areas designed as sleeping quarters in fire stations, police stations, ambulance stations, rescue stations, ranger stations, and similar locations. Dormitory unit was changed to dormitories, and then item 3 was expanded to include guest rooms and guest suites within dormitories. So they've kind of expanded the bedroom requirements and called out these particular types of uh, like I can't even think of the word. I'm sorry, but they expanded it. Next slide. Article 225, outside branch circuits and feeders. So the scope in the 225.1, there's a new informational note, number 2. This note says, or excuse me, this note clarifies that Article 225 requirements are in addition to those found in Article 210 branch circuits and Article 215 feeders as applicable. So you got to meet the requirements in those two articles, but the ones in 225 are in addition to those. Next slide. A small change in Article 225.18 clearance for overhead conductors and cables, where not in excess of 1,000 volts was removed from the text. Uh, it's not needed anymore because we've got a new article for over 1,000 volts AC and 1,500 volts DC. That'll be Article 267. So Article 225 is below those thresholds. This wording was not needed anymore. Next slide. Article 225.31, disconnecting means. Revised that the disconnecting means shall comply with 225.41 if used as an emergency disconnect. Next slide. So 225.41A1, emergency disconnects general location. The revision for emergency disconnects for 1 and 2 family dwellings state that the disconnect can be installed on or within sight of the dwelling. So that kind of opens the door a little bit that within sight of the dwelling, that's you can see it not more than 50 foot. So that means if you have a disconnect uh, where the say where the conductors enter a structure or building, if I could see that disconnect, it's not more than 50 foot, then it could be used by emergency disconnect, but it does not have to be on the dwelling. That's good. I'm glad they made that change. Opens the door for some more installation options. Next slide. Article 230, services. Uh, Article 230.2A, listing requirements listed. Again, what I spoke about at on Monday's webinar. Dot 2 will contain all your listing requirements in a particular article. And item number 6 to this article, a permanently mounted abscess voltage tester was added to what is required to be listed. Basically, all the listing requirements that were found in 230 were moved to that 230.2, and then they've added this permanently mounted abscess voltage tester into the what's required to be listed. Next slide. Article 230.2B, listed requirements listed or field evaluated. All service equipment is required to be listed. We'll find that in 230.2A, but there may be some time where some equipment may not have the listing on it. Well, this particular article here says it can be field evaluated also. So it kind of opens up the door for that. Next slide. Again, that article that we looked at in 225, same thing in this 230.24b. They removed that where not in excess of 1,000 volts was removed from the text. There's the article for over 1,000 volts or 1,500 volts DC for services will be in Article 268. Next slide. Article 230.46, splice and tap conductors. There's a new informational note that recognizes SVC marking as equivalent to suitable for line side use. So the a particular uh, one of these devices, if it doesn't have suitable for line side use, as long as that it's got that SVC, it will be okay. Next slide. Article 230.62c, service equipment enclosed or guarded and barrier placement barriers. They just now have to be identified. Barriers only have to be identified. Article 230.68, meter sockets, an exception to that article. A revision to relocate meter socket requirements from Article 230.66 to Article 230.68. The new exception was added that meter sockets for fire pumps shall have a rating of not less than that of the fire pump circuits. Those of you that's installed fire pumps, usually the overcurrent protection devices can be rather large, especially like if it's an instantaneous trip breaker. And then if you're sizing your meter to the overcurrent device, then you would have a much higher, probably a CT meter or trans socket or something like that. This exception tells you that you only have to size the meters for the fire pump circuits. Now that's what the National Electric Code says, but we, the Development Service Department, or excuse me, Austin Development Services, we enforce the National Electric Code. Utility companies have their own set of criteria, and I can't respond to those. Next slide. Okay, so we've had some changes in Article 230.70A, general service disconnect location. I'll say with these changes, with the help of Austin Fire Department, we was able to remove one of our technical amendments for the 2026. I appreciate the Austin Fire Department allowing that. But here's what we got. The revision mandates that a service disconnecting means for 1 and 2 family dwellings must now be located in a readily accessible outdoor location, either on the dwelling or within sight of the dwelling unit as defined in section 110.29. But those of you that's been doing installations here in Austin, you said, well, we've always been putting it on the outside. That's because of our local technical amendment. But since now they're requiring it on the outside, there's no need to say that anymore. Now, there's an exception that allows for the service disconnect not to be installed on or within sight of the dwelling if the requirements of Article 225.41 are met. Just previously looked at that. That's for the emergency disconnect. So with the disconnect, service disconnect, or even the emergency disconnect, not necessarily having to be on the structure, but can be within sight of the dwelling unit, that kind of opens the door for a lot more options when installations. I don't know if you can really see this picture or not that I've got, but we have a rack service off of two dwellings. In the 2023 code, we would have had to have a disconnect at each one of those dwellings. But with this new 2026 code, we could use the service disconnects that are out on the rack. Uh, you know, possibly the back unit. You can't see it, so we will probably have to install a emergency disconnect on that one. But it could be where you can take this code and Article 225 and kind of look at your installation. It might keep you from having to buy extra disconnects, possibly. Next slide, please. Okay, so 70B service disconnect marking, a revision to ensure the clear identification of service disconnects and emergency disconnects in one and two family dwellings. This same language is in that 22541 as well. It's got to be located on the outside front of the enclosure, and I hope everybody sees this right here. And if nobody's in this webinar, I'd like for everybody to tell other electricians that the letters are going to have to be at least half inches high. Uh, if you've got these emergency disconnect labels, the letters going to have to be a half inch high, and of course, durable to withstand the environment. 23070D, identification of other source disconnects. Revision that a plaque or directory is required if all sources are not located at the service disconnect. Next slide. General replacement exception. There's an exception that was added. If only meter sockets, service interest conductors, or related raceway and fittings are replaced, the requirements of 23078-1 and 23070B2 shall not apply. So if you're replacing just only those parts, that the disconnect requirements would not apply. This is National Electric Code. Check with your utility company. They may have other requirements. Next slide. Article 23070F, General Remote Disconnect Control. We have this article now that says that a remote disconnect control device used to actuate the service disconnect shall not be considered a service disconnect. So if you're using one of these little EPO switches as your service disconnect, you will not be allowed to do it in the 2026 code. Make sure with these buttons that you consult your utility provider and the fire department in your area for additional requirements or restrictions. Next slide. 23071A, maximum number of service disconnects general. A clarification that certain disconnects, though physically present, are not counted as part of one service disconnect requirement, such as you see here, surge protection device, power control equipment, etc. Next slide. Article 23082, equipment connected to supply side of the service disconnect. A new list item to allow a permanently mounted absolute voltage tester on the supply side of the service disconnect. Next slide. Article 240, overcurrent protection. Article 240.7 was relocated to 240.2 for the listing requirements. As I've been stating, almost all the listing requirements are all now contained in .2 in each article. Fuse reducers were added to the list. So fuse reducers will have to be listed. Article Article 240.7, overcurrent protection devices. The new article lists the overcurrent protection devices that are suitable for providing protection to service, feeder, and branch circuit conductors, as well as equipment. So now we've got a whole list of these. They're listed out in Article 240.7. Next slide. Article 240.21, location and circuit. Article 240.21 has been updated to include specific requirements for transfer secondary conductors. And as we learned on Monday, we have a new definition for transformer secondary conductors. The reason the definition was added was pretty much for this article here. Additionally, the revised language provides clear distinctions between transformer secondary conductors and feeder tap conductors. Next slide. Article 240.24E, location in or on premises not located in bathrooms, exceptions. As hopefully most of you know, you're not allowed to have an overcurrent device in a bathroom. It doesn't say panel, it says overcurrent device. But they've added a new exception, was added to allow overcurrent protection device to be added to an existing panel board located in a bathroom if the panel board was installed in compliance with previous code additions. And as somebody has been doing it a while, we could put those in bathrooms at one time. So there are some. Matter of fact, this picture here is from one here in Austin. There was a panel. Unfortunately, they had to move it out of the bathroom, but this new code and new exception will allow those to stay. I will say you have to watch clearance requirements, and just because there's a panel in the bathroom, there may be other code violations as well. Next slide. Article 242, over voltage protection. There again, .2, listing requirements, requiring all surge protection devices to be listed that are rated 1,000 volts or less AC or 1,500 volts or less DC. We'll be seeing a lot of listing, a lot of stuff that was previously required to be listed will be in the 2026. Next slide. There's our reconditioned equipment. The revision prohibits the use of reconditioned surge protection devices and surge arresters. Next slide. 242.14, Type 2 surge protection devices. The revision states that Type 2 surge protection devices must comply with one of the three acceptable installation methods, but not all three. 2023, the way it read, you would have to meet all of them. But they've cleaned that up and just say, hey, you only have to do one of the three. That would be either low side of the service disconnect overcurrent protective device, low side of the first overcurrent protective device at a building supplied by a feeder, or the low side of the first overcurrent protective device in a separately derived system. So now you only have to do one of these. Next slide. Article 250, grounding and bonding. Article 254A5, general requirements for grounding and bonding, grounded systems, effective ground fault current path. They just basically updated the formatting. No new requirements. Makes it easier to read now. Next slide. Article 250.8A, connection of grounding and bonding equipment, permitted methods. Grounding and bonding terminations were added to the permitted methods. Terminations was added to the permitted methods. Next slide. Permanently installed generators, non-separately derived systems. Another slight change, the word where is replaced with if. Next slide. 250-53A4 grounding electrode system installation, rod and pipe electrodes. Uh, if previous, or like 2023, whenever you're installing a ground rod, you're you're supposed to first drive it 8 foot, and if you encounter rock, then you could drive it at 45-degree angle, and then if you encounter rock, then you can bury it. But a lot of people jump right straight to the 45-degree or the bury it. But the revision in the new code said it must be driven first at 8 feet. So you have to attempt to drive it vertically first, then go to the other methods. But it's always kind of said that. It just spelled it out more now. Next slide. Article 250-64C, grounding electrode system installation continuous. A revision to allow splicing of grounding electrode conductors with listed grounding and bonding equipment when accessible. So if you see this picture of a split bolt, if this connection is accessible and that split bolt is listed as grounding and bonding equipment, you can use that. Uh, no irreversible crimp, CAD welding. Of course, codes minimum, if your engineer requires it, you'll have to do that. But if this split bolt is listed and it's accessible, you can use it. Next slide. 250-64D1. Uh, this particular article here is just replacing words as permitted by with in accordance with. 250-64E1 grounding electrode conductor installation, raceway cable armor and enclosures for grounding electrode conductors general. A revision to add cable armor and to clarify the bonding requirements for ferrous cable armor applies to both ends of the armor, just like a ferrous metal raceway. Next slide. Article 250-64G, grounding electrode conductor installation enclosures with ventilation, mounting, or drainage openings. Current code says you cannot install a grounding electrode conductor in a ventilation opening. The 2026 revision added in mounting and drainage openings. So you will not be able to do what this little picture shows right here, that drain hole. You cannot bring that grounding electrode conductor up through that drain hole, mounting holes, or ventilation holes in 2026. Article 250-94A, bonding for communication system, intersystem bonding termination devices. A revision to clarify where intersystem bonding terminal can be connected, including directly to a building or structure with a minimum 6 gauge copper conductor. They've cleaned up this this article. It's a little easier to read, and they have included this where you can mount this device on a building. It previously didn't say that, but it does now. It kind of clarifies now that you can mount it on a building, but it has to be connected with a number 6 copper conductor. Next slide. Article 250-102A, grounding conductor, bonding conductors, and jumpers material. Non-flexible metal raceway and fittings were added to permissible bonding jumper types, aligning with Article 250-30A2. So basically, besides a wire type bonding jumper, you can use a non-flexible metal raceway and fittings with this new revision. Next slide. 250-102B, metal and non-metallic enclosures. A revision was added to cover an effective ground fault current path for non-metallic boxes and enclosures where metal pipe and raceways come into these non-metallic boxes. It tells you how to do your effective ground fault current path for these whenever you do this. We already had it for metal, but we don't have now. We'll have for non metallic enclosures. There was a lot of medium voltage articles that were added in chapter two. Like I said, we're not going to look into those, but as you see, all the grounding and bonding requirements that were in 250, I believe it was part 9 of Article 250 that had over 1,000 volts. That has now got its own article, Article 270, and similar to all the other articles, like Article 240, where they had a section of over 1,000 volts, it now has its own article. So anytime you're working in these over these voltages, you'll have to go these particular articles for those requirements, whether it be for overcurrent device, branch circuit feeders, services, grounding, and bonding. Next slide. All right, that's it for today.
Well, thank you, Marty. That was a whole lot of information, but
Yeah, yeah, it was.
but that's okay. Again, we're recording
Yeah.
this so we can put it online so people can go back and review it if they want to take a look at it again. We have a few minutes. I don't see that any questions are in the Q&A box right now, but if you do have a question and you'd like to ask, please feel free to raise your hand, take you off mute, or if you want to take a moment and put in your questions into the Q&A box, we can we can handle it that way too. Um, but while we're waiting for that to see, we have on the left, there's an engagement survey that you can take, and that'll just tell us how we did today or any suggestions about how we can improve things. On the right, you'll see the NEC classes. So you got here somewhere. Goodness. But if you want to come back and make sure that you can get signed up, go ahead and do that. And then um, lastly, take a look. If you would like to, if you're not already signed up, we have our Building Connection. It's a monthly newsletter that goes through several different things within the not only our department but other departments that affect development. Um, and yeah, if you have any other questions, and we'll be on for just a second, but I still don't see that anybody has anything. So with the give it just a minute, but otherwise we can wrap up a few minutes early. But
Yeah,
again,
yeah. I want to tell
oh,
everybody thank you, and we'll be looking at chapter 3 on Monday.
and yeah, if you have your colleagues, go ahead and if this is helpful, or if you, I think just they can come to that, and we hope to see everybody on Monday. Okay. All right. Well, thanks so much for attending, and we will see you all maybe on Monday. Thank you.